shrapnel wound, it's not sewn up right away because all the dirt and dust and crap is still in your body and it has to drain out. If you try to sew it up before it's all drained out and purified, it's just going to molder onto there and stay infected and come back to haunt you. And that's what the country has basically done with Vietnam. It hasn't waited for the wound to really heal and drain and purify itself. It's tried to just sew it up and wait for the scar to form. And the scar hasn't formed.
While the scar hasn't formed, perhaps the healing process has begun. Tens of thousands of names on a wall commemorating our dead and still missing soldiers from the Vietnam War. Is proper attention finally being paid the Vietnam vets? Have they come home at last?
Hello, I'm Fred Noriega. At various times, the Vietnam veterans have been scolded, ignored, blamed. Their feelings, experiences, and concerns pushed aside. Though we hesitated to call our men in uniforms losers, we couldn't call them winners. There were no heroes and no ticker-tape parades. For many Vietnam veterans, the war in post-60s America was overwhelming.
I'm Marie. Circumstance applied to any one group of people, it would be the veterans of the Vietnam War. After experiencing unprecedented horrors, they came home to a stagnant economy, their GI benefits diminished by inflation. They came back to a public that did not see the deep emotional scars suffered by hundreds of thousands of them. Later in this program, on-the-record accounts of what is and what is not being done for these men who were victims of circumstance.
On this edition of Channel 2 The People, we will bring you up to date on the effects the Vietnam War has had on our country and the men who fought it.
The fact of the matter is that the public and the country at large does not want to really pay the bill. They don't want to really pay what it has to take care of veterans.
I thought it was a patriotic thing to do. I mean, it was American flag apple pie and God bless America at the time. I couldn't be wrong. I saw 6 guys killed in a firefight one afternoon, and that was for nothing. These lives were snuffed out for nothing. That couldn't be. We desecrated bodies. We booby-trapped North Vietnamese bodies because they booby-trapped and they desecrated our bodies.
I don't know how I'll tell my son about it. I don't know if I'll ever tell anybody all the bad things that have happened, all the things that I can remember and am beginning to remember.
Coming back here was like, where's someone, who can I talk to about, the experience I had? But there was no one.
They just didn't care when you came home from Vietnam. People, it was like you had the flu. Everybody felt sorry for you, but no one wants you to get close.
People I go to school with, my professors, people I work with, they're telling me I did something that was really wrong. We were baby killers and murderers. And I best just, forget about this and keep it inside.
The war in Vietnam was confusing, complex, and fought for reasons few can articulate. Yet some 2.9 million Americans served there. Moreover, it cost our country more lives than did the Korean conflict and was as painful and divisive as the Civil War. There were no glorious battles, no heroes, and no heroes' welcomes for the youngest corps ever of U.S. veterans. They came home to an atmosphere of resentment, apathy, and in some cases, outright hostility. More importantly, they returned to a society often unprepared and unwilling to deal with their unique problems.
Well, coming home for me was really an experience wherein I had a rifle in my hand, German muzzle. I had live ammunition in my pocket.
Vietnam vet Bob Harris decided to store his combat rifle in a public locker before going off to a hotel for a much-needed rest. Like that of many vets, his return was disorienting and scary. It's called post-traumatic stress, and he faced it alone.
I stayed in the hotel for maybe 2 days without coming out. So I came back to the locker to, get my rifle, When I got there, the police and everyone was there. So I'm trying to figure out what's wrong, So he said, well, hey, you have ammunition, you have weapons, we're going to arrest you and whatever. I said, no, I'm just from Vietnam, I'm ready.
Bob is now a counselor at a Veterans Outreach Center. He is one of 5 vets with whom I recently met to discuss the impact of their Vietnam experiences and their various efforts to mainstream themselves back into society. The other men are Bruce Baltricitis, now a tax accountant, John Catterson, a lawyer, John Rowan, a community board district manager, and Bob Pacek, an administrator at City University. The stress was so acute for some of these men, that they have only recently come out of the closet to reflect upon their war and post-war experiences.
I did some things that, you know, of course, you couldn't transfer to New York City in 1982 and do them and not wind up in jail. But given the circumstances and given the context, we did what we had to do. And I think we did it honorably, and I did what I did honorably. And for a long time, I wouldn't allow myself to feel that way. I think I thought I did something very wrong, and I don't know whether I was punishing myself for having done it or afraid that I would be punished if people knew that, you know, that I did what I did, but it had to stay inside.
When I was in Vietnam, I decided that if I get out of here alive, I'm going to try and make something of my life. That's why I was very angry when they would close the college campuses during the demonstrations. That got in the way of my my goal, my objective. And all I wanted was a degree. I just wanted to get on with my life.
I thought everything changed, but it wasn't that the world changed. I changed.
The experience cost us. Whether it just cost us the bare years that we lost, the 2, 3, or 4 years, or whether the psychological and physical residue of the war is still costing us.
It would have been nicer if things worked out different for those of us who survived and came home.
In some ways, former infantryman Ron DeBoer, now a senior Con Edison technician for City Hall, was luckier than most. His employer held his job for him pending his return. Ron wanted to go on to college as well, however, and take advantage of the GI Bill. But he was both surprised and disappointed by the relatively paltry allowance it afforded him.
I received $134 a month while I went to college, and that was to cover room, board, books, and tuition. I don't think that would come close to like in World War II, where they were given tuition, books, plus $52 in living expenses, which back then was worth something.
Why were Vietnam vets treated differently?
One of the reasons that has been perpetuated by the establishment, by the legislators back then, was that it was just too expensive. That college back in 1968, 69, 70, 71 just cost too much money. And our answer to that was, and what we were saying back then was, well, you should have thought of that when you drafted and sent 2.48 million men to fight a war. Perhaps people thought that it wouldn't be as dangerous to treat the Vietnam veterans a little bit shabby, since they weren't motherhood and apple pie as were the World War II veterans. Perhaps they thought that they could get away with this, and they did.
Ron felt shafted in more ways than one. While he evaded any direct hit on the battlefield, he did not escape unharmed.
I had hyperpigmentation, as did many of the men in my platoon. I had severe headaches. I had acne condition. And then when I got home, I have cancer.
Ron is one of over 50,000 vets who believe that they or their offspring are now suffering the ill effects of Agent Orange, a herbicide containing poisonous dioxin that our own military sprayed upon the Southeast Asian countryside.
When I was in Vietnam, I always felt like I had a steel pot and a flak jacket and a weapon and a tree to duck behind if needed. But when you have cancer, it's something like your body has betrayed you. It's like something you have no control over. And it was frightening, very frightening.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy
Life is good for John Catterson, and while he feels a need to remember and reflect on days past, John is putting Vietnam behind him more successfully than many.
And I'm one of the lucky ones. No question about it. I lived through the war. I've got 2 healthy children who haven't been affected by the defoliants, and I use the government and its programs. A lot of guys didn't have that opportunity, and a lot of guys had real problems, emotional problems, psychological problems. They couldn't use the system.
Calling attention to the still pressing needs of other Vietnam veterans is part of the reason John joined 100,000 of them in Washington this past November. They were also there to pay tribute to themselves and to help dedicate a memorial. 140 panels of granite inscribed with the names of the 57,939 Americans killed or listed as missing in action during the Vietnam era.
I knew these guys. I knew this fellow rooted for the Yankees. I knew he had red hair. I knew he was, like Schaefer beer. And now it's a name in a wall.
I don't really even understand why, but we had to touch the names. We had to find our friends and touch them and just have that physical contact.
It just makes your survival even more intense. I was maybe an inch or a millisecond away from being grit blasted into that granite.
The parade was an incredible high. It was fantastic. On Const Avenue, I had my son on my back and my wife and my daughter in a stroller. And I don't care if there was only one person standing on the curb waving, and there were more than that. But we were there, and we know we were there. And to that extent, it represented a turning point.
I think it was a major change. Every goddamn kid that's going to troop through Washington and going from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial and back is going to walk by that monument and see it and say, what is it? And somebody's going to have to make an answer for it.
I think the danger is a lot of people are going to think, well, these guys finally got their parade and they got their memorial. I hope, we don't have to hear from them anymore. They can shut up about Agent Orange and all their other crazy things.
There is a segment of the population that wishes we would go away, that wishes the whole Vietnam experience would go away, but there's also a segment of the population that wants to turn back and embrace the Vietnam veteran and say thank you and say welcome home. And they were there.
Vietnam continues with Marie Torrey in just a moment.
Undeniably, the turnaround point for the Vietnam veterans movement in this country was the return of the hostages from Iran. When we had the ticker tape parade here in New York City, celebrating the hostages, I was in the office that day. And believe me, the phones were ringing off the hooks, and people were calling saying, listen, not to take anything away from what the hostages went through, but compared to what you went through and the fact that you never got a welcome home, this is outrageous, and I want to do something to help.
Life is better for the Vietnam veteran, no doubt about it. But is it good enough? Or as good as it was for the veteran of World War II? Answers differ depending on who you talk to. Past commander of the New York County Veterans of Foreign Wars, Andy Laddick, says, for example,
Vietnam veteran is not being shortchanged.
Battle-scarred Vietnam vet Robert Mueller says,
people think veterans' benefits are basically the same today as those that were afforded the veterans of the Second World War. Absolutely untrue. I'm talking about education assistance, employment assistance, acute medical care, enhancement and expansion of the counseling program.
I don't think they was interested in anything when they come back. They even didn't go after their schooling. And I think a lot of them thought they were going to have something going to give it to them on a paper plate, and that wasn't so.
For more than a decade, they simply shunted aside, rejected all too often the Vietnam veteran as part of that long-hair, counterculture, hippie generation that lost the war in Vietnam.
I could see the long hair when it's neatly kept, but when you see them wrong and you see the beards and their mustaches and everything else that's going, and you see the clothes that they wear. If they put a shirt and tie on Sunday, I think that would be a miracle.
A generation gap or a reflection of public attitude? A ranking member of the Veterans Administration, Dr. Arthur Blank, himself a Vietnam vet.
The experience of Vietnam was a very difficult one for all of us. And I would have to say that the nation has perhaps yet to really begin to deal with the meaning of the war for our society.
One of the ways government is trying to deal with the problems of Vietnam veterans is to make psychiatric counseling available to them.
I think their psychological problem was brought onto themselves when they came home. I don't think the war had actually done anything to them except on a fellow that might have been in actual real combat, He might have been hit 1 or 2 times over there, and it affects his mind. There's no question about it.
An exhaustive government study last year revealed that 1/4 of all Vietnam veterans still suffered crippling stress as a result of war experiences. This reinforced the need for the kind of psychiatric counseling offered at the Veterans Administration's outreach centers, organized in 1979 specifically for the post-war problems of the Vietnam vet.
It's a trailblazing and innovative program. The Veterans Administration and the government generally has really not done anything like this before.
Dr. Arthur Blank is director of the Readjustment Counseling Service, which oversees the 136 outreach centers housed in storefronts and other non-governmental buildings to ensure against the Vietnam vet staying away because of distrust of official organizations.
They're manned very often by combat veterans. They know what the needs are of the Vietnam veterans in the community. They're able to talk to them one-on-one, and it's a great program in that sense.
But, says Robert Muller, founder of Vietnam Veterans of America, it's not enough.
Our phones here ring off the hook with people that want referrals to, a lot of times women call and say, my husband's not sleeping at night. He keeps waking up with nightmares, or so on and so forth. Or he's having a drug abuse problem, drinking problem. The calls that come into us requesting referrals for help is the best indication we have immediately of the fact that there is a tremendous need out there that's not being met.
I think most of these veterans picked up this drug habit after they came home and not over there.
Muller remembers that Budget Director David Stockman wanted to terminate the outreach program.
It was last year, if you may recall, that Stockman said that our stinking $12 million readjustment counseling program was inflationary, extravagant, and unwarranted. And we had to fight, believe me, our toughest legislative battle to preserve the readjustment counseling program.
The Congress voted unanimously to continue the Vet Center program in the summer of 1981. The Senate by a vote of 99-0, and the House by a vote of 383-0. I don't think that kind of unanimous vote is produced entirely by pressure. I think it is produced as well by conviction on the part of the people's representatives that this is something deeply important.
Yes, attitudes appear to be changing, and more Vietnam veterans are joining the traditional organizations. But Muller remembers times of resistance.
There were too many cases where our guys went into a VFW post, went into an American Legion Hall, and were basically kicked out.
We practically had to beg these guys to join the VFW. They didn't come over like a lot of the other fellows and come over and say, hey, where do I join up? Where's a post?
We were looked upon, although we were the soldiers of our generation, as simply part of that counterculture generation, you know, long-haired, pot-smoking. That's what became the image, and that's what the traditional veterans organizations couldn't swallow because it didn't meet the mold that they expected of a patriotic, you know, gung-ho American. Later for that. Well, now we're saying later for you, pal.
There was really very little idea of the magnitude of the public health problem that was going to be presented by returnees from Vietnam.
But the public image is changing, and along with it, says Arthur Blank, health services.
I think there is intense and continuing interest on the part of both the Congress and the Veterans Administration in other areas of need, including Agent Orange and educational benefits, problems of disability, and this sort of thing.
But the Vietnam veteran, adds Arthur Blank, must participate in bringing about more services and consideration.
The Vietnam veterans, including myself, have had the problem in the past of being too angry to teach, too lost in our own rage and anger to get to the point of being able to help folks who really, if given a chance, would like to understand and help.
Robert Muller has learned to control his rage and anger, but it's evident nonetheless.
When I came back from Vietnam, having suffered gunshot wounds, I spent a year in Kingsbridge VA Hospital in the Bronx. There is no way I can describe that year in the VA hospital. It was understaffed. It was overcrowded with patients coming back from Vietnam. The facility itself was totally dilapidated. We did not have even basic minimum equipment for therapy.
Special attention certainly was needed and was certainly absent for a long time. I think that situation has changed in the past couple of years.
19, 20, 21-year-old guys were coming back put into a situation that was as depressing as you can imagine. A lot of the older guys from the Second World War had gone there as a form of nursing care.
In the VA hospital, after 6 months, if you're in there, they find a place in the nursing home. They will not keep you in the hospital. Regardless if you got an amputee, you got 2 legs missing this, they will not keep you in that hospital.
Less than 15% of patient care in VA hospitals is provided for service-connected or service-related injuries or diseases, any kind of disability whatsoever.
A different percentage is offered by a VA spokesman in Washington who says almost 30% of the patients discharged in '81 involved service-connected vets, and that close to 50% of outpatient visits were service-connected. The war injured have a #1 priority for free medical care for life. And the spokesman adds that a high number of VA hospitals are affiliated with medical schools, which he feels continually upgrades the quality of this care for these veterans. Meanwhile, a reflective note from Arthur Blank.
I think right now that the struggles and pain that vets have had and that the nation has had about Vietnam, I think eventually can turn into something quite positive for all of us. One can find sources of one's strength, and one can learn from what one has lived through. And I think that that's going to happen not only for veterans, but for our country as well.
Over a decade to come to grips with the Vietnam War, and just as long for the